Hello, my name is John Solomon. I'm with the Good Faith Cybersecurity Researchers Coalition, a not-for-profit initiative of the Cybersecurity Advisors Network, or CYAN. In turn, another not-for-profit initiative, in CYAN's case, an international trust network of cybersecurity professionals. The GFCRC is an industry initiative designed to mobilize academic and industry support in the direction of the recommendations made by the OECD for legal protection of responsible cybersecurity researchers and disclosure. This video is part of a series where I speak with interesting people, stakeholders across policy, technology, business, academia, and other areas relevant to this field about various topics relevant to the general area of cybersecurity vulnerability research, vulnerability disclosure, its impacts on industry and society, politics, law, etc. I'm here today joined by Kazuo Noguchi. Noguchi-san is both with Keio University in Japan and with Hitachi based in New York, and came to us via an introduction from the Keio CCRC. And I'll give Kazuo an opportunity to talk a little bit about that and about himself. And if you'd like to introduce yourself, give us an idea of who you are, where you're from, we'd appreciate that very much.
Thank you, John. This opportunity, when Nick approached me with you, and then I said, okay, this is really an informal conversation. This is a great opportunity to know more about what's going on, as well as sharing some, if possible, to kind of meaningful the contents. My name is Kazuo Noguchi. I'm now residing in New York City. Beautiful weather. Actually, a couple of days ago with my wife, we took a picture from Central Park. And so I'm here as the part of the Hitachi America in New York, as well as the Keio University's senior researcher. And so when I was asked, also INC COE perspective, International Cybersecurity Center of Excellence, many academia get together globally and having the C2C, country to country, CTF, as well the research doing, as well as the MCAC and so on. It's my pleasure to have the conversation with you, John.
Excellent. Thank you very much. And we'll mention a lot of the organizations and links to them in the description of the video, or in the case of the audio only version, for those of you joining us via podcast, in the description for the podcast itself. So I think I'd like to start a little bit maybe from the international aspect of your work and drill down a bit to both the academia specific as well as the national, the Japanese perspective on this topic. You mentioned that you are active in the open-ended working group. Now, this is a group that is I believe it's driven by or affiliated by the United Nations. Can you talk a little bit about that, and we'll get into the maybe the mechanics of it in a second?
Yes, yeah. The origin that I got involved was 2019. The Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Japan and NISC approached Hitachi. Somebody can join this from corporate perspective of the United Nations cybersecurity discussion. It's called Open-Ended Working Group, OEWG. It's not really open, however, but a part of the United Nations activity started public-private partnership. I said, okay, I'm living in New York and very close to my office. I can join. And it was the interesting setting I heard from other people, the private sector, to get involved for the UN discussions. It's not that kind of common, but to understand and impact as well as stability. If ever I can contribute, I said, okay, let's continue and still get involved. There are a lot of open-ended working group. Is not only cybersecurity, but some crimes and nuclear perspectives and so on. But this is linked with the other activities as well. and the company is also involved for the like 17 the sustainable development goal, which is particularly from environment perspectives. But United Nations Security Council is really the biggest one, started World War II. But because of the fact that the cybersecurity is utilized, sometimes the weaponized, and also the negative use are coming up quite a lot. And these days, including ChatGPT's abuse or some the supply chain abuse or cyber's malicious way to attack. So that combined is kind of big attention. So the purpose is really stabilize to make it permanent so that so we as a citizen or individual can rely on the internet well enough. So that's our origin. And then, so there are a lot of discussion these days, international law, which is current focus, particularly the July will be. And the last one in March was the public-private partnership from the private sector or non-government perspective. Those are the discussions, but the norms, rules, the behaviors, the responsible behaviors, the focus and continuous dialogue, that's also a very important one. And the confidence building, capacity buildings, those are the kind of thrusts or pillars of the discussions.
Okay, thank you. And before I start on this next part, I have to be very clear that the GFCRC is not a part of the OECD. We are not affiliated with the OECD officially. We support the objectives and the recommendations of the OECD. And also, I should be very clear that we don't generally talk to legislators, to policymakers, to enforcers, to government agencies, especially not in G20 countries. We leave that to the OECD and their colleagues. We talk to industry and academia. And this is where this topic of public-private cooperation is very interesting. Now, looking at the open-ended working group description, there's a lot of focus in the description of the group itself on threats. When threats are only really threats if they can exploit a vulnerability of some kind. You mentioned policy, you mentioned international law and norms more importantly. Can you tell us a little bit about the tone of, without violating any confidentiality, of discussions on international, maybe legal alignment or norms alignment about vulnerability disclosure, vulnerability research, and understanding why threats, cyber threats specifically, become threats? Or are the representatives from industry and government using this forum to discuss this, and how?
Indeed. The threats are actually every meetings of OEWG, 1 week meeting, the beginning is kind of potential threats and the recent threats, including ransomware and DDoS attack, and recently potentially is AI is coming up, as well as the from industry perspective, supply chain is another one coming up, particularly critical infrastructure, which I'm also from industry perspective involved. It's really important one. But the legal perspective, every country has different jurisdiction and different laws, and the coordination is really the difficult one, as far as I understand. And Japan has its own law, and US has law. I'm living, and the EU and individual country has one, and the UK has one, and how to share the real threats or potential threats are very difficult one. Sometimes we are talking about the security clearance or secret or top secret. For the government perspective, industry has industries really own secret, and some are competitive areas. How to share is really the difficult one sometimes. So the OEWH perspective right now, as far as I understand, leveraging, so Main Street people, particularly in the West, are related with like the current international charters, and so which are very solid, charter and international human rights, and so on. And in the meantime, some countries are talking about separate cybersecurity laws may be needed, and whether or not that can be aligned with the current existing international law. That's a kind of big debate. And that will happen in the July meeting, as far as I understand. And for a couple of the key highlights are that what is the definition of the active defense? Active defense meaning that you, without knowing the other side or tapping into the research, it's very difficult to understand what's really the facts, rather than waiting until you are attacked. So that's a definition, the spectrum of really passive to the active defense. Some of the laws I saw, or the White House started to publish, like dismantling the threat actors, or some of the UK's or countries such as the EU countries, somehow they spelled out what is active, and sharing with industry, particularly the secret or top secret or related with critical infrastructure, that's also a very difficult one. But how to make the alignment with those are really difficult one. But for instance, Netherlands mentioned the open-ended working group. They started to share, as well as the same month, White House shared that kind with the tools. And so rather than waiting the kind of attacks for the critical infrastructure, or that's not probably the intent for the citizens' perspective, how to make the civilization going on for the new technology is really the intent. But unfortunate that the negative use are occasionally, obviously, kind of observed. So the law can be kind of identified not to do that. After saying that vulnerability by norms, rules cannot work, law could be a next level. And as far as I understand that Solarium cyber report in the US spelled out the push towards end, meaning that defense forward, meaning that or rules, norms, if it doesn't work well, next level is the kind of cost sanction, and the final third place military actions, and so on. But for the civilization or the private sector's perspective, the intent is different. Intent is innovation, and also the supplying to everybody's life, electric grid, water, and the trains and the airplanes, how to make stabilize and trust each other somehow. So that's an intent. But the legally perspective, it's coming. I had a conversation with different perspectives that each country has a different one, of course. But again, for international companies to align with, it's very difficult to coordinate with different regimes or regions and intent of each countries.
So the United Nations is obviously not a policy-making body, but rather a forum. And I mean, you mentioned a couple of countries that I think are very interesting in this regard, as well as the concept of critical infrastructure. We've seen recently, last May, the United States announced that it would no longer seek prosecution for vulnerability researchers under the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act. Belgium just recently, this February, explicitly wrote into law protections of vulnerability researchers. The Dutch, you mentioned the Netherlands, have always had a very pragmatic approach to this. Industry, obviously, especially international firms that are part of critical infrastructure, have a very, very clear interest in the dependable and timely availability of new information about vulnerabilities. So these threats that are often shared and discussed, they don't become critical. Is this a trend that you are seeing? Because, several countries, their laws are still very restrictive. They're still very old. Do you see a general trend to accepting this as a development, this more openness towards pragmatic treatment of cybersecurity vulnerabilities?
Yes, indeed. I agree with your observation. And without sharing proper information for actions, it's very difficult to protect for the fundamental critical infrastructure for everybody's needs. Certainly, as you mentioned, some countries, not the exception for Japan these days, just started based on the announcement by Prime Minister Kishida mentioning that the cybersecurity and protection with the public-private partnership towards implementing security clearance, that is coming up very clearly because of the need for information sharing to protect, to know what's really happening as a fact, and also the resilience from European perspective, they spelled out very well. Even there are some attacks to resilient backup or business continuity or some alternative to keep. So those are important coming up.
So let's move on to Japan a bit, since you mentioned it. Reading up, I am about as far away from an expert on Japanese cybersecurity laws it gets. My focus is very European. But reading up a little bit, if I read, the Japanese, the unauthorized computer access law, it seems to me it deals very explicitly with access to systems. Where it gets really interesting is in the Japanese penal code, where specifically it mentions unsolicited penetration testing, something that only the National Institute of Information and Communications Technology is allowed to do. Now, you mentioned the Prime Minister's, Japan, I think, has always, in my experience, had a pretty good public-private coordination in some aspects of cybersecurity. Japanese CERT is very mature. It is very well connected into AP CERT. Several of the Japanese sectors are very, very well connected to the government side of cybersecurity. Where do you see this staying as it is? These legal restrictions on research, or do you think that's going to change?
So gradually changing. That's I'm hoping to see. The last December, there are 3 pillars of the national security strategy came out, and it was signed, which is good initiative. But clearance was not mentioned. Cybersecurity portion was not spelled clearly. Very small portion. Then how the big, I have to step back. That as far as I understand, that the law prohibits to collect information from outside, in particular, of Japan. So that particularly, you mentioned that telecom laws and also touching up on the constitution and how there are some trial to change the constitution, but it didn't happen. But if there is any exceptions for the good faith, which is the theme here, and because of the fact to protect the citizens or protect the life, how to stabilize and to understand, to know, and the resilient. So needed to know is another good term. Without necessity, you don't have to know. and getting the good information to act or stabilizing. So that's an important one. But even that, Japanese law is not permitting at this point, no exceptions and so on. So that became the part of the behavior, or it's guilty to get the information. Thus, there's no information available.
Can I ask you that? Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you, but this one thing that really jumped out at me, right? That you said, and the phrase "need to know." This is in some legal frameworks a very contentious concept. Can you tell us a little bit about what determines that under Japanese law, and who determines that?
Japan doesn't have that one yet, as far as I understand, but that's a U.S. law.
Okay. So that's in Japan, basically, there's just right now, but it seems to me like there is still a very, very restrictive approach to vulnerability research generally. I'm going to go out on a limb here. My experience with every single international company that has a significant dependency on critical information systems, with me, it's mainly financial sector, but not only, has an interest, implicit or explicit, in having access to vulnerabilities. This is why we have Patch Tuesday from Microsoft since 2002, 2003, because they were forced into doing it. You are, among other things, a specialist on public-private discourse in cybersecurity in Japan. Can you tell us a little bit about, again, I use the word, the tone of discussions between the private sector stakeholders and the government in the various government agencies in terms of, maybe driving change, helping understand that this kind of information, not only threat sharing, but actually vulnerability sharing and disclosure are developing legally in practice, operationally. What is happening and where do you see this moving towards?
Yes. The tone is changing gradually. Last year or so, particularly what's happening is the Ukraine situation. More than 1 year, it's not really somebody's problem. It's coming to the international problem, particularly Asia Pacific region, including Taiwan. From Japan's perspective, it's close the friends, and how to protect or work together, U.S. and other countries, is really the big question. To get the kind of isolated island physically, so it's naturally protected by sea in the past, but this digital as well as the negative use of cyber can be a kind of wake-up call, in a sense, not anymore for somebody else's problem, but still including law and the culture are not necessarily addressing those, including a number of cybersecurity the researchers as well as the kind of frontline warrior, if you will. It was very nice, safe, comfortable after World War II, concentrating on the economic area, and that's why the economic security is coming before national security. And many people are uncomfortable to talk about national security or some sort of jumping into from private sector to talk about national security. So that's a culture. It's difficult to shift quickly to prepare. So that's another gap of the public-private partnership. How to trust the information, how to collaborate each other in terms of the kind of trusted information, and also the people to people. There is also negative, the factions or, let's keep safe. Don't talk about war. That kind of tone was there, but since there are some of the incidences coming up. So people started. But how to make it a balance? That's really the key things. The law as well as this information security, information infrastructure with the government as well as private sectors, and to work together. So that conversation started. So that's a good news or progress.
So it's interesting that you mentioned defense. I mean, Japanese Constitution Article 9 obviously is very restrictive on all things military. Now, we saw Prime Minister Abe, may rest in peace, obviously he was quite vocal about, revisiting parts of that. At the same time, it's really interesting with Japan's case because Prime Minister Kishida in February, he mentioned, in terms of, you mentioned Ukraine, and he said that Japan will support Ukraine. I believe his words were in its own unique way. And at the same time, there is, China is obviously can be a little difficult at times. In Japan's case, with the Senkakus. At the same time, Japan is generally flexing its muscle more internationally, becoming more of a player, not only in Asia Pacific, has a huge, obviously, industrial and commercial base, a lot of international champions, and a very, very, significant academic and research capability that is cranking out a lot of this cybersecurity capability. So I find it really interesting that you specifically called out geopolitics and keeping society safe, seeing as how there's not only a lot of potential threat actors that could threaten that stability, but also a lot of potential both affected parties and resources to contribute to that general discourse. Is that dialogue? What shape is that dialogue taking? Are there forums for this? Are the universities involved? You're with KO, so that's obviously one of the most prestigious ones in Japan. I don't know if it's the prestigious one. I don't know the Japanese space so much, so forgive me. How does that look? Where does one talk? Where does one get together and discuss these issues?
As you can guess, it's a combination of formal and informal. Informal conversation, trusted communication to talk about that will start scratching. The U.S. expression all started from the napkin on the restaurant, and then that will become the source. And sometimes the government, private, the official meeting works very well. Because of the government mentioned we have to do this to convince whole company for the large company, traditional companies. So those are kind of combination of those. But to reach to the point for the formal one, needed to have a lot of discussions, as well as there are some good conversation. I'm also mentioning a couple of times black ship strategy. Black ship means that when Meiji period opened up from Edo period, there was the significant impact by U.S. black ship or Commodore. The Perry went to with a big bomb. So huge gap was realized. The shock came to the Japan. We needed to do something, change, and then started to become more democratic or westernized, if you will. That kind of shock worked as long as there are some good understanding and the background of those. And there are 1.5 discussion or 2.0 discussions, public-private discussions, as well as the conditioning to make the clear decision. Takes sometimes longer than expected, but whether or not we can wait for that a long time, given there are a lot of things moving ahead these days. So the Japanese government started to realize, also the companies realized, we have to speed up somehow. So that's hopefully the great kind of direction. And the key part is that many things are linked to each other with different countries and regions to coordinate well, as well as the keeping the good culture and the communication, and how it works may not be exactly working from Europe or US or UK, ASEAN, but a coordination of those are needed. But again, people understand sometimes, but cannot do. So that the coordination also needed to be done.
Well, it's Japan is not the only place by far that where policy discussions move slowly. Sometimes I live in Europe, and I mean European Union conversations, 2020, I think 27, 28 stakeholders. I forget how many countries we have now. So, but it's refreshing to hear that it is a universal truth in policy making cybersecurity that a lot of this starts over dinner before it moves into the formal sphere. Last question. I'd like to ask a little bit more about the academic side of things. Now, you are closely involved with INCSCOE. Could you tell us a little bit about that and what its role is in terms of coordinating academic approaches to cybersecurity research and related topics?
Yes. The INCSCOE, International Cybersecurity Center of Excellence, we started to form loosely 2016 and then 2019. We formalized, signed with the 6 university president level from 3 different countries, and started with some of the research international perspective, and the education training is the second pillar, and also the conference or workshops. I said there are another one, and the policy is another one. And for the research perspectives, for instance, we started with the IoT industry coordination. Also, not only purely research, but government policy as well as the education in mind. So started with the international perspective of electric grid, for instance. And the recent one, the manufacturing, IT and OT. Operations technologies are quite behind in terms of the standardized internationally. So the perspectives from industry, government of certain countries to coordinate. And the one of which I was really surprised was that the hardware and software and somewhere between IoT, how to make sure that everything is trustable, and came up with some technology, worked with the, for instance, nuclear power plant, and how to make very secure that the industry perspective. Then that can be applicable to other industry perspective, but costly. But what is the best for the innovation as well as the cost perspective, but very needed area, not avoidable for those security area. So we started or restarted because of the COVID time, and the webinar series started. What would be the next one? For instance, ransomware could be a good one because it's going towards 10 trillion US dollars. That's really the big one for the cost of the negative use or cyber crime side. So the 10 trillion is the number 3 countries level. So that's a big impact to global economy. But how to make the kind of small areas, like a city level, like New York, London, Tokyo, for instance, and the global perspectives, that could be a conversation that we may expand. But depending on the research, but certainly this research, good faith, the active defense side, certainly could be a good on the table for the future potential research team.
Well, we'd love to. We'd love to talk to the organization if you'll have us for a dialogue. I think especially given some of the heavy hitters like Royal Holloway and KO and others that you have in that group. That is a very, very illustrious group that's going to have quite a few, I think, academics doing some impactful work. The mention of IoT and SCADA systems, particularly, but not only in critical infrastructure. I think this is a sore point, and sometimes I think the discussion suffers a little bit. You mentioned ransomware, a huge threat, massive economic loss, but generally not one that is the result so much of vulnerabilities as of human failures. So what we really want to do is to make sure that the discourse doesn't just focus on one or the other, but takes a holistic approach on the one side to realizing systems, software are very often insecure. So are people. It doesn't mean one is more important than the other one, regardless of economic loss. So, but it's good to see that these multiple sides of this critical issue are being addressed by people who obviously know what they're talking about. With that, I'd like to thank you very, very sincerely for taking time for me today. I hope the cherries are still blooming in my home country in Switzerland. That's unfortunately stopped by now in Spain. It's too dry. It has been a pleasure talking to you. I want to give you the opportunity, if you have any comments that you'd like to wrap up with, to close up the conversation.
Yeah, thank you so much, John. This was a nice conversation, and hopefully we can continue.
You were a man of many, many fascinating activities, and I definitely hope that we can, for example, in one of our other video channels for Cyan, talk about some of these other activities in a bit more detail. So, Noguchi-san, thank you very, very much again. And for all of you who are watching or listening, I will link to Kazuo's LinkedIn profile and share information he allows me to, as well as some information about the GFCRC and Cyan and many of the topics that we discussed in this chat. And please don't hesitate to visit us at gfcrc.org and the Good Faith Cybersecurity Researchers Coalition, as well as at cybersecurityadvisors.network. And with that, I wish you all a very, very safe and secure rest of the day, week, month, whatever you'd like, and take care and see you on the next one.